Hello and welcome to the State of the Fleet Market, a weekly video series produced by Automotive Fleet magazine. I'm Mike Antich, editor of Automotive Fleet, and today I'd like to examine what's occurring in the fleet market for the week of August 10th, 2020. And the big news this week was the release of the job creations report for the month of July, and it was released just this last Friday, August 7th. This is now the third month in a row where actual job creation exceeded the initial forecast by economists. And it's also the third consecutive month where job creation exceeded 1 million jobs. So getting into the details, for the month of July, there were 1.8 million new jobs created, or perhaps a better way of framing this, or a more accurate way of saying it, is that in the month of July, there were 1.8 million jobs restored since the economic shutdown. And another way of looking at all of this is for the months of May, June, and July. These 3 months recaptured 42% of all jobs that were lost during the start of this pandemic, and as we've begun now an economic recovery. But with any data, it can always be perceived different ways. Some are perceiving it as still a glass half full, while others are perceiving it as a glass half empty. I like to view the actual data versus having someone interpret the data for me. And as some of you may know, my initial interest prior to entering journalism was in the area of history. And my instructors always stressed to me that if you want to understand history, you need to go to the source documents versus reading someone's written interpretation as to what they think actually happened. So in the case of this situation, what is the source data? The source data is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They're the ones that capture the number of jobs created, not only for these past 3 months, but historically. So I decided to go in and examine what job creations were for the past 10 years on a month-to-month basis. This is for the period of 2010 to 2020 to see how these current months compare. So the number of jobs created in July 2020 was actually the third greatest number of jobs created or restored in the past 10 years, despite the fact that this was during a period of COVID-19 resurgence of infections. So for comparison purposes, what was the fourth largest month in the past decade? Well, the fourth largest month was February 2018, and during that month, 406,000 jobs were created. So if you compare July to the fourth largest month, February of 2018, 4 times as many new jobs were created in July than that prior record. And also, for comparison purposes, the fifth largest month was June of 2014, where 326,000 jobs were created. And the fastest recovering region in the month of July was actually in the Southeast. And this is despite the fact that that was one of the areas where we had the resurgence of COVID-19 infections. And what was driving this recovery in the Southeast was construction activity. And this was also a key factor throughout the country. So altogether, for the past 3 months, from May, June, and July, there were 639,000 construction jobs created. So why is this important? Because construction is really a key bellwether for the fleet industry, since the construction segment is one of the top buyers of pickup trucks and vans. But we need to keep this all in perspective. There is still a deep hole that we need to dig out of. Real GDP decreased at a record rate of 32.9% for the second quarter of 2020. Now, this is the sharpest economic contraction in the past 73 years. So what happened 73 years ago? It was the Great Depression. So we're at Great Depression era levels in terms of economic GDP contraction. And another sobering statistic is that despite this job creation for these past 3 months, which look promising, there are still 30.2 million Americans who who are still continuing to receive unemployment checks. These are very sobering numbers. So how is the economic recovery impacting fleet sales? And one way to examine this is comparing calendar year 2020 against calendar year 2019. And this is sort of the period of January through July. And when you look at this comparison, the numbers and sales for the 2020 calendar year are pretty depressing. But these are forever skewed, and they're skewed by the fact that during part of the month of March, all of April, and part of the month of May, all of the OEM factories were shut down and no fleet vehicles were being built. So when you look at the cumulative breakdown of January to July 2020 fleet sales, this is how it breaks out. Commercial fleet sales are down 27%, daily rental fleet sales are down 54%, and government fleet sales are down 11%. All of which are pretty dismal numbers, but again, they're primarily being driven by the shutdown of the automotive assembly plants. And perhaps a better way of examining this in the current context is comparing the month of July 2020 against the preceding month of June 2020. So here the numbers take on a different complexion. Here, commercial fleet sales are down just 6%. And what's dragging down the commercial fleet sales are several key fleet segments. In particular, the insurance industry, oil and gas industry, and to a lesser extent, the pharma industry. Not only is this being substantiated in terms of overall fleet sales, but it's also being substantiated in the amount of business activity that's being captured in the miles driven through telematics data. All three of these segments are experiencing lower miles being driven. Another segment to examine when comparing July 2020 against June 2020 is the daily rental fleet segment. That's down a staggering 85%. But actually government sales are up 41%. So there is an uptick in the number of units that are being acquired by government sales, government political subdivisions. Another way of looking at what's going on in terms of fleet sales is looking outside of the light duty market. When you look at larger Class A trucks, they're probably an even better barometer as to the state of the U.S. economy. According to ACT Research and FTR, as of August 5th, preliminary Class 8 net orders jumped to around 20,000 units in the month of July. And this represents a 28% increase in orders, which is almost double the amount of trucks that were sold in July 2019. So now let's examine what's going on with the new vehicle retail sales. Retail sales continue to be strong. A lot of this is being driven by the fact that there's a shortage of inventory on dealer lots, and there's also continuing to be strong buyer demand. Now, while new vehicle deliveries are increasing to dealers, it's a great situation for dealers because those vehicles aren't staying on those lots very long. We hear of a lot of pre-selling of vehicles, which is great for dealers because it helps reduce their floor planning expenses. But the question is, how long will this continue? And the key factor here that I look at is really consumer confidence. People are not going to be making major expenditures if they're uncertain about the economic future. And the resurgence of the COVID infections did put some downward pressure on consumer confidence. The other factor that will influence new vehicle retail sales for the balance of 2020 will be the government injection of stimulus monies in the economy. And while there's current bickering and negotiating going on, it's not really a question whether it's going to happen, but when it's going to happen and the amount of money that's going to be injected. And we know that there's going to be at least a minimum $1 trillion additional money stimulated and injected in the economy, which should go a long way towards stimulating new vehicle sales. Another factor to take into account, though, is a recent release of data by Moody's Investor Services, and it does anticipate that lending requirements are going to further tighten, which will be making monthly payments more expensive. But at the moment, things look good on new vehicle retail sales. So let's next examine what's occurring in the wholesale used vehicle marketplace. And again, you got to remember that this is really a snapshot in time. This is what's happening the week of August 10th. And wholesale used vehicle sales continue to remain strong. Prices are remaining strong. This is primarily driven by the ongoing shortage of inventory in the marketplace. But as anyone in the industry will tell you, this is a short-lived phenomenon. We are expecting a large influx of used vehicle inventory entering the wholesale market over the next 6 months. And this is primarily going to be comprised of off-lease vehicles, ongoing downsizing on rental fleets, and the actual doubling of delinquencies and repossessions of vehicles. And this increase in inventory, which is anticipated in the second half of this year, is going to put downward pressure on used vehicle prices. So how much is the anticipated decrease? According to Black Book, they anticipate that late in the fall, wholesale prices will be down 5 to 10%, primarily due to the increased supply of inventory and weaker demand by buyers. So next, I'd like to conclude my presentation by doing a lightning round, examining key areas that are emerging that we should be on the lookout for. So last Thursday, August 6th, the Trump administration imposed a 10% tariff on Canadian aluminum to protect U.S. Producers. And this is going to have an impact, and this is going to be impacting fleet costs, especially with upfit products that are fabricated from aluminum. The anticipation is that the tariff will not only drive up costs for end users such as auto manufacturers and suppliers, but for all downstream users of aluminum across all industries. Another ongoing concern is reduction in fleet budgets. Automotive Fleet recently completed its last industry pulse survey on July 27th, and one of the interesting revelations is that fleet managers continue to express concern that their fleet budgets will be reduced in the next 3 months. Only 36% of the surveyed fleet managers felt confident that their budgets would not be cut. So when we asked those fleet managers who had expressed this concern about cuts in their budget, we asked them to give us a guesstimate of the percentage of reduction to their fleet budget. And the largest response was that they felt their budgets were going to be reduced by more than 10%. And the last point that I'd like to bring up is this whole area of mobility providers. And prior to the pandemic, everyone viewed mobility services as the future. A lot of us in the fleet industry, we're now reframing ourselves as being mobility providers, mobility associations, mobility companies. But today, that's not as certain as it once was prior to the pandemic. And a good case in point is Uber as a public company. It releases this data. And on August 6th, it said its revenues for the second quarter dropped 29%. It's still making money of $2.2 billion, but it has been a dramatic decline as a result of customers continuing to be wary about using a ride-hailing service due to concerns about COVID-19 infection. And this revenue decline was the steepest since Uber went public on May 2019. I anticipate that business will continue to remain sluggish for the ride-hailing companies, at least until a vaccine is more widely available and proven. The key takeaway here is that it continues to reinforce, at least in my mind, the truism that we in fleet, we don't control our own destiny, and we're going to be forever influenced by outside forces over which many of us have no control whatsoever. the best that we can do is to try to mitigate the impact of these outside factors. So this concludes my State of the Industry presentation for the week of August 10th, and I'd like to thank you for listening.